I'm so excited to present our next film because not only is it one of my favorite films of all time, but it's one of the greatest film noirs ever made. And this may be the first film from the 1940s I featured on my little series. Not only that, it's inspired by a true story, a true crime story. So we've got two of my favorite things to look forward to in this installment: old time Hollywood and true crime. So, where do I begin? This time I'm going to try something different. I'm going to first discuss the true crime that inspired the film that I'm excited to talk about, and maybe you can guess what the film is based on my clues. In 1915, in New York City, a 20-year-old woman named Mary Ruth Brown met a 33-year-old artist named Albert Edward Snyder. May went by Ruth to most people, and for some reason went by the name Tommy to close friends. The couple had very little in common. Ruth was described as vivacious and gregarious, while Albert was described as a homebody. Despite their personality differences and age difference, the couple married and settled in a humble home in Queens. In 1918, Ruth gave birth to their only child, a daughter named Lorraine. At this time, Albert was employed as an editor for Motor Boating magazine, and when I first read the name of the magazine, a different image went through my mind, but I digress. Motor Boating magazine was published for the most part of its run by William Randolph Hearst and earned Albert $100 per week. In 1925, Ruth began having an affair with a man named Henry Judd Gray, a married corset salesman who lived in the New Jersey suburbs. Ruth began planning the murder of her husband Albert and enlisted Gray's help, but he was reluctant. Ruth's hatred for her husband began when her husband insisted on hanging a portrait of his late fiancée, Jessie Gichard, or JG, on the wall of their first home, and even had his boat named after Jessie. Albert's fiancée had died 10 years earlier, and he often described to Ruth that Jessie Gichard was the finest woman I have ever met. There were also claims that Albert was emotionally and physically abusive to Ruth, blaming her for the birth of their daughter as opposed to having a son. It was alleged that Albert demanded a perfectly maintained home and would physically assault both Ruth and the daughter Lorraine when his demands were not met. Once Ruth had enough of the abuse and found happiness with a new man, she persuaded Albert to purchase life insurance, and she did so with the assistance of an insurance agent who was subsequently fired and sent to prison for forgery. The agent signed a policy for $48,000 with a double indemnity clause, paying extra if an unexpected act of violence killed the victim. According to Henry Judd Gray, Ruth had made at least 7 attempts on Albert's life, all of which he survived. On March 20th, 1927, the couple strangled Albert with some picture wire, stuffed his nose full of chloroform-soaked rags, and they beat him with a sash weight. Then they staged the death as part of a burglary. Judd tied Ruth up and left her to be discovered the next morning by her poor 9-year-old daughter, Lorraine. Ruth didn't want to wait the entire night, though, so she called out to Lorraine, and Lorraine ran to a neighbor for help. Detectives who investigated the crime weren't having it, though. They could find little to no evidence that a burglary had taken place, and Ruth's behavior was so inconsistent with her story. She was obviously no terrorized wife who witnessed the brutal homicide of her husband. Detectives discovered that property that Ruth had claimed had been stolen in the burglary had been hidden in the house. Jewelry that she had claimed had been stolen had been found hid, hidden under her mattress. This is my favorite part right here. The real breakthrough in the case came when detectives found a paper with the initials JG on it. It was a memento Albert kept from his former fiancée, whose initials were JG. When detectives asked Ruth who JG was, she wasn't even thinking of her husband's former fiancé. She was thinking of her accomplice, Judd Gray. To her, it was the only time Judd Gray had even been mentioned in the investigation. She asked detectives, what did Judd Gray have to do with the murder? She even asked detectives matter-of-factly, oh, did he confess? Her story fell apart so fast. Both Judd Gray and Ruth Snyder were interrogated officially, and both were charged with Albert Snyder's murder. Of course, at trial, both turned on each other like you do, but both were convicted and sentenced to death in the electric chair. On January 12, 1928, Ruth Snyder became the first woman to be executed at Sing Sing since a woman named Martha Place in 1899. She was executed 10 minutes before Judd Gray. The daughter, Lorraine, for some odd reason, didn't find out how either one of her parents had died until a year after Ruth's execution, so whomever hid it from her did a very good job of hiding it, considering how high profile the case was.
Ha ha! Your mom's a jailbird!
An interesting fact about Ruth's execution is that it was surreptitiously photographed at the moment electricity was running through her body with the aid of a miniature camera strapped to the ankle of a Chicago Tribune editor named Tom Howard. So that picture exists. The only thing I can say about Ruth Snyder and Judd Gray is thank goodness most criminals are dumb. It makes them easier to catch, and their crime was very brutal, more brutal than the crime in the film their story inspired. Sometime after the crime, the daughter Lorraine actually tried to cash in on the phony life insurance policy. I won't delve too deep into that except to say that it didn't work since it was proved that the policy was forged. If you haven't guessed the film I'm going to discuss today, it's Billy Wilder's Double Indemnity, starring Fred MacMurray, the always amazing and flawless Barbara Stanwyck, and the always enjoyable Edward G. Robinson. The screenplay was written by Billy Wilder and Raymond Chandler, and it's based on a novel written by James M. Cain. Now, Double Indemnity is told in flashback, so I think the best way to synopsize the story would be to do so in flashbacks. The film starts when an insurance salesman named Walter Neff, played by Fred MacMurray, stumbles late one night into his empty Los Angeles office after being wounded from a gunshot. He starts to record on a dictaphone a confession for claims manager Barton Keyes, who is played by Edward G. Robinson. A year earlier, Walter Neff makes a house call about the automobile insurance of a Mr. Dietrichson. Dietrichson isn't home, but his wife Phyllis Dietrichson is home, and the two flirt upon meeting each other. Phyllis asks Walter about getting a life insurance policy on her husband without her husband's knowledge. Things are already moving pretty fast. Walter Neff reaches the obvious deduction that Phyllis is contemplating murder, and Neff wants no part of it. But he can't help but be fascinated with Phyllis Dietrichson, and he struggles with the temptation to use his knowledge of his business to outsmart the insurance company. Later, Phyllis visits his apartment, and the two concoct a plan to have Mr. Dietrichson sign a life insurance policy without him realizing he's doing it. Then they plan the murder of him and frame it as an accident to trigger the policy's double indemnity clause with a higher payout. Walter slips a copy of the life insurance policy in with the copy of the Dietrichson's automotive insurance renewal, and Dietrichson signs the life insurance policy thinking that all the paperwork is related to the automotive policy. Before the murder can take place as originally planned, Dietrichson breaks his leg unexpectedly. This delays and complicates the murder scheme. When the plan is finally put in motion, Walter Neff hides in the back seat of Phyllis's car while she drives her injured husband to the train station. Neff breaks Dietrichson's neck, leaving the dead body in the car with Phyllis, while he boards the train with a fake plaster cast on his leg posing as Dietrichson. A helpful passenger almost ruins the plan, requiring Neff to keep his hat pulled low and his face averted. Neff sends the passenger on an errand for cigars to vacate the observation car. Neff then jumps off the train at a pre-arranged location where Phyllis helps him stage Dietrichson's body on the tracks. Either the next day or some few days later, Neff's boss believes that Dietrichson's death was a suicide. Barton Keyes, a determined claims manager, proud of his track record of spotting fraud cases, nevertheless scoffs at the idea of suicide. Keyes does find it odd that Dietrichson did not file any claim after breaking his leg. He begins to suspect that Phyllis and an accomplice murdered her husband. He reasons that Dietrichson was unaware of the policy. Keyes then questions Neff, who affirms that Dietrichson signed the policy. Neff and Keyes have known each other for 11 years, so Keyes takes Neff at his word. While all this is going on, Neff befriends Phyllis's stepdaughter, Lola. Lola tells Neff that she saw Phyllis trying on mourning clothes several days before her father's death, and that she believes Phyllis, who was her mother's nurse during an illness, had killed her mother to marry her father. Lola now fears that Phyllis plans to kill her next for the money. Neff now begins to see Phyllis for what she really is. Let me just interject. This is why you shouldn't just kill someone at someone's behest. You don't know how far their depravity goes, and you could be next. Phyllis Dietrichson is in my top 5 list of deadly femme fatales. I think the one I'd choose for number 1 would come as a surprise to you. But back to Double Indemnity. Barton Keyes finds the witness from the train's observation car, the one that Neff was trying to avoid, and the witness says that the man he saw on the train was not the Dietrichson he was shown in photos. He fails to recognize Neff, who was present at the meeting. Neff warns Phyllis that going through with the insurance claim in court risks exposing the murder, and he insists that they should not see or communicate with each other until the investigation is over. A new man named Nino Zacchetti, who was originally Lola's boyfriend, has been visiting Phyllis every night since the murder, and Barton Keyes now suspects that Nino is her accomplice. Neff, now suspecting that Phyllis is now manipulating Nino to kill him and Lola, confronts Phyllis and threatens to kill her. Phyllis shoots Neff, but when he comes closer and dares her to shoot him again, she does not. She instead says that she never loved him until a minute ago when I couldn't fire that second shot. They embrace. Neff shoots her twice with her gun. As Neff leaves, he sees Nino walking up to the house. Neff convinces Nino to call Lola and make up with her, which, if you ask me, is some terrible advice, but I digress. Neff finishes recording his confession. Then he looks up and sees Barton Keyes, who was summoned to the scene by the janitor who saw a trail of blood leading to the office. When Neff asks how long Keyes has been listening, Keyes responds by saying, "Long enough." Asking for a head start, Neff plans to flee to Mexico, like you do. But Keyes says that he won't make it to the elevator. Neff collapses in the doorway as Keyes calls for an ambulance and the police, and the two wait for them to arrive. Neff tells Keyes that he couldn't solve the case because the culprit was too close, right across the desk. Keyes responds, "Closer than that, Walter." Walter responds, "I love you too." The end. I love Double Indemnity. That's one of those films that I usually watch once, then I start it all over again. It's that good. The standout performance was obviously the powerhouse that is Barbara Stanwyck. I don't remember who beat her for Best Actress that year, but Barbara was robbed. She's one of those actresses that could play good, bad, funny, brilliant, dumb, strong, vulnerable, etc. And any film noir filmed by Billy Wilder goes without saying. I often play Double Indemnity and Sunset Boulevard as a double feature. There is one scene in Double Indemnity that makes me laugh, though. I don't think its intention was to make anyone laugh, but it's the scene where Fred McMurray and Barbara Stanwyck are trying to remain inconspicuous in a local grocery store while plotting their crime. They couldn't be more obvious that they're up to something. I imagine the real Ruth Snyder and Judd Gray might have had meetings like that in public, since those two weren't the brightest fuses in the electric chair. Anyway, I've been talking forever. I'm sure you're sick of my voice by now. Double Indemnity is not available for streaming right now. It is available for purchase on digital. It was released on Blu-ray by both Universal Studios and the Criterion Collection. I recommend the Criterion Collection version. Bye, y'all.